was also the professor at Georgia Premier College, where he taught American history. Dr. Liu has written extensively on China's political development and the grassroots democracies, including 3 edited book series such as Rural Elections and Governance. Today he will be presenting on the topic of the politics of urbanizations in China and its pros and cons. And let me get the...
I don't have a PowerPoint.
Okay. Just close this. I don't like the slide very much, so let me change it.
And go back to the. Thanks. I want to thank Xiaojing for inviting me to come over here. I want to thank Mindy for the introduction. When I was asked, I was in China to talk about urbanization. I thought, I have nothing to offer. I really don't know much about urbanization. I said, maybe the only thing I can talk about urbanization is the political side of urbanization. So last night I was reading to prepare for the presentation today, and I ran into a term. It's called political urbanization, and this is coined by Professor Yasheng Huang at MIT. So it's really good. I guess英雄所见略同. I came up with the idea of political urbanization, and lo and behold, there is actually a term like urbanization. But after the 3 presentations today, I kind of think I really don't have much to offer because everything is talked about. When Professor Wang is here, I think if you want to summarize his speech, it's really patriotic, right? He's saying, China is where money is going to be made. China is where ideas are going to be invented. You study China. But of course, his call is not just to make money or to be innovative, but to make China a better country. Because if China is peaceful and stable, I think the whole world will be better off. And then, Professor Lu talks about, his speech is really historical and comparative, very, very informed. And then Professor Yang's presentation is very technical, with lots of pictures and comparative. So what I'm supposed to say, all ground is now being covered. I really don't have much to offer. So what I'll do is, I'm also a historian by training, like Han Chao here. So what I'll do is I'll offer 2 historical references, in terms of urbanization, and then I'll share with you 2 anecdotes. Lastly, I'll give you some random thoughts about political urbanization. I think China's urbanization is very messy. It's very unfair. It's highly explosive. It is going to be, if not well managed, it's going to be a huge destabilizing factor in China. And of course, right now, what is the most important thing in China? It's Wending. It's political and social stability. Without stability, according to our leaders or their leaders, nothing can be accomplished. China right now spends more on maintaining stability than defense, and that's very, very alarming. Not only to the Chinese but also to the people outside China, because nobody can think of a China, evolving into a chaotic society. As Feilin mentioned earlier, the rise of China or the decline of China will have huge impact on the whole world. Now, historical references. As I studied American history, so in the United States, there's a very famous thesis. It's called the Frederick Turner thesis. He delivered a speech in 1893, and this is a very important year in Chinese history. Can anyone tell me why that year is important?
The birth of Chairman Mao.
Exactly. A farm boy, from the countryside was born in 1893, and that's the year when the frontier in the United States closed according to census. So his speech basically, it's entitled "The Significance of Frontier in American History." What he's saying is that what makes American civilization tick is this rapid move away from the cities. So he said, you look at American history, Americans came from, Han Chao mentioned, European history started with city-states. Americans moved from corrupt, decadent European cities. They arrived here, uninhabitable, very rural American continent. So once they settled along the Atlantic coast, they felt, this is not good. We need to move into more rural areas. So they moved into the Appalachian Mountains. But they didn't stop there. They moved into the Mississippi rivers. And they didn't stop there. They moved into the Rocky Mountains. And they didn't stop there. They moved all the way to the Pacific. So what he was saying is it's all countryside. It's all rural environment that give birth to the so-called American character, the American spirit. And many historians spend their entire life trying to debunk his theory. It's very hard to repudiate that thesis. However, we cannot imagine America without cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and of course, our great Atlanta. But Americans do not attach as much importance to cities as we Chinese do. Okay, so that's one historical reference. The other historical reference is in China, if you talk about revolutionary history, you talk about the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, you always talk about 农村包围城市, so the countryside surrounding the city. So there are actually three such events in Chinese history. So the first, of course, is 1949, when the countryside, the Communist Party mobilized the peasants, and they overthrew the rulers, whose base was in the cities. So we call that 农村包. It's land revolution, 土地革命, in the Chinese revolutionary terminology. Now the second event, which is the beginning of so-called reform and opening up, 改革开放, that also started with the countryside. A bunch of villagers, farmers, in Anhui province, where Fei Lin and I claim to be our hometown, they felt, we need to distribute land, even at the risk of our lives. The 18 households in Xiaogangcun decided they're going to basically adopt the land themselves. We call this 联产承包, it's a household responsibility system. That also started with the countryside. The third rural revolution in China started around 1986. This is the introduction of village elections. So you see, in China, if you look at the 62 years of communist history, it's always, sort of rural changes were the engine, were the driving force of China's modernization, if you can use that term. However, I think right now it seems the whole thing is now being flipped. The cities are now the driver, it's the engine of China's growth, and the countryside is being increasingly marginalized. So I just want to offer this sort of, I thought it was very interesting. If you look at Americans and their view of the city, and you look at how important a role the countryside played in China. However, the countryside now is being marginalized. The second, as I said earlier, I want to share with you just two anecdotes. One is, one time I was having a conversation with Wang Zhenyao. I don't know how many of you is aware of this name. Wang Zhenyao is known as the father of village democracy in China. He's a director general in Minzhengbu, Ministry of Civil Affairs in China. And last year, he resigned as director general, so no longer Sigang. And this is very rare in China for someone to resign his official post, and now he's the dean of school of EGG. Jet Li has a foundation called One Foundation, and now he's the dean of that school. what he said, which impressed me very much, he was here because he was a fellow at the Kennedy School. So over Christmas, I invited him to come over here. This was 1999. And he said something that, I still remember today. He said, look at all the officials in Beijing or in all the other cities in China, is that most of them probably were born a rural boy or girl. They managed to get into the cities either through serving in the military, being employed by factories, or, since national examination was introduced, by taking the exam, get a college education, and then you end up settling in the cities. And what he said next is, once they become urban dwellers, they quickly forgot their roots. They no longer give any consideration, even though many of their relatives still live in the countryside. It's just, when they make decisions, they don't give any thought to the countryside, to their roots, to where they came from. I thought that was very, very profound finding, is how come, many of the officials today, they were born into rural families. And I'm just one generation removed from the countryside. My dad was a farm boy. At the age of 17, he decided, he was tired of, planting, and he decided to join the military. That was back in 1937. And, my father was a farmer, but, once he became a military person and an urban dweller, I don't think he ever thought about the relatives he still had. I mean, he did, but not in the ways that, there are lives out there, that when you make decisions, you have to take their life into consideration. So that's one anecdote I want to share with you. The other one is I was at the conference at Cornell University, and it was 2008. A professor from Trinity University talked about urbanization. And he said something that shocked everyone in the room. He said the biggest urbanization fiasco in China is the development of Pudong in Shanghai. Everyone thought Pudong is great, right? Isn't that the beacon of China's urbanization? You look at the skyscrapers and all that. He said, how many people actually live in Pudong? What kind of housing did Pudong provide to common citizens in Pudong? And can migrant workers really afford to live in Pudong? And he said, as far as he's concerned, that's the worst planning, that's the worst urbanization achievement, quote unquote. And he said, if the government refused to spend money to provide affordable housing to China's migrant workers, then the government actually should allow migrant workers to build slums. Piminku. He said, Shanghai, Guangdong, and other big cities, should actually emulate what Mumbai in India is doing. Is that you got to provide affordable housing to them. If you don't, then how can you make their life relatively comfortable? And that just really shocked everyone in the conference room. And of course, Fei Wang said earlier, Hu Jintao or Wen Jiabao might have heard our voices. Everyone simply ignored this economist's suggestion, saying China's urbanization is going the wrong way. Lastly, I just want to share with you some random thoughts, and then I'll take questions, and all of them, you probably have more questions to them too. Again, back to the third Nongsun Geming, which a lot of scholars label that as the silent revolution, Wusheng Geming, that's village elections. When it first started in 1986, everyone thought, this is the beginning of political reform in China. It started in the countryside. Eventually, it's going to be elevated to the township level, to the county level, and hopefully, Deng Xiaoping made the prediction, saying 50 years into 21st century, all Chinese, will be allowed to elect their president. So we're waiting, right? 40 years away. We'll see if that is going to happen. But that didn't happen. So the second question being asked by the scholars is, if peasants or farmers were allowed to vote, village committee chairs, what about urban dwellers? urban residents. Aren't they better educated? Aren't they better informed? If farmers can elect the village committee chairs, urban developers certainly, can elect their, 居委会主任 or their local People's Congress deputies. And of course, nothing happened along that line. So the last question now being asked and answered is village elections are bad. Because what happened after these elections in the countryside, they said, well, look, number one is the bad people, what they call the 村霸, or mafia in the countryside. They were able to get elected because if you don't vote for them, you're going to get beaten. Second is violence. We do have isolated cases of village candidates being murdered. They said, look, Chinese people are just not educated or raised in that way. They don't know how to participate in democratic culture and democratic elections, and also vote buying. Right now in Guangdong and in other economically developed areas, if you want to run for village committee chair, you have to pay the voters to get elected. Anywhere between $500,000 to $1 million you have to spend, if you're running for the committee chair. So the case is closed. We Chinese are just bad people. We don't know how to do elections, and so we still have to wait a long time. So that's one random thought is, there is this initial euphoria, optimism, that elections started at the village level. Now if you listen to Wen Jiabao, and he said this 2 weeks ago, March the 14th, at the press conference. Our premier doesn't do a whole lot of conferences, only once a year. And he said when Chinese learn how to manage their villages, they're going to learn how to manage the townships. Once they learn how to manage the townships, they're going to learn how to manage the counties. That's the trajectory. But that's still just rhetoric. There is no plan, to move the elections up. So on that front, I think Xiaojing early on asked me, where do you think China's political reform is going? Right now, it's not going anywhere. Second, related is China's policies are oftentimes made with the ignoring. I mentioned this earlier. Is they totally ignored the farmers, the peasants, which still is accounting for the largest sector of Chinese population. Now, early on, I forgot to mention, here in the U.S., Han Chao said 87% urbanization. So the farm population is very small, but they are the best protected special interest groups in the country, in this country, because they are represented by members of Congress. And in China, how many ever farmers we say, anywhere between 600 million to 900 million farmers. Who are representing them? Nobody. Nobody are representing them. 3,000 people are sitting in the Great People's Hall at the annual session of the National People's Congress. But out of those 3,000, who are speaking on behalf of the farmers? I don't think we can easily identify who are, because they are all from different provinces. Many of them are celebrities, a lot of them are officials, and a lot of them are from the military, but who are representing the interest? So therefore, most of the decisions made in China are basically at the expense of hundreds of millions of Chinese farmers. Professor Yang talked about the Gaotie, high rail system in China, which is, of course, creating a lot of conveniences, but a lot of problems. The fact that the minister now is waiting for trial is an indication of how wrong the whole development of Gaotie is going. But who can afford to ride in those trains? Certainly not the migrant workers. I just read an article in New Century, 新世纪, about the whole Gaotie system. The best Gaotie station is now in Wuhan. You go there, nobody is around, because nobody can afford to ride in the Gaotie. So, if we talk about the farmers, if we talk about the peasants, I was in Beijing Nanzhan. riding the train from Beijing to Tianjin. Yes, it's very fast, 27 minutes. Before you can finish drinking up your tea, you're in Tianjin. But that station is very, very quiet. It's not a hustle bustle, Beijing station during this Chunyun, Han Chao mentioned, how many people are on the road. But you go to these Gaodian stations, it's really very, very quiet. Of course, outside Nanzhan, you do see a lot of people. These are the Shangfang people, right? You see automobiles with different license plate from all provinces, because they're there to try to get a hold of their people and then send them back. And land possession is another issue, because urbanization requires land. And in China, the government owns all the land. And so therefore, these land could be taken away by the government. Of course, the government now is also taking the land away from the farmers, sell them at a very high price to the developers. I mean, this is the income for all the local governments. And it is pegged to GDP. Of course, wherever you are in charge, if the GDP goes up, you're promoted. If it doesn't go up, then you don't see any promotion. And that is also packed with urbanization. So that's why I say it's not only messy, it's also brutal, because the livelihood of the farmers are being ignored. And also, of course, Fei Wang is not here. He wrote a book on household registration system, hukou system. And because of the hukou system, it's not easy for farmers to become urban dwellers. If you don't hold a hukou in the city, then you don't have equal access to education. You don't have equal access to healthcare. You don't have equal access to anything, Social Security, employment benefits, you name it. So China is actually divided into two. I think Han Chao said, it's one country, two societies. It's one country, two groups of citizens. You have urban citizens, you have rural citizens. And the rural citizens are second-class citizens. They don't have access to the entire range of being a citizen of this great country we call People's Republic of China, because there are people who are more equal than others, and that is sad. And I think urbanization, nobody can stop that, but urbanization will have to go in a way that, it has to be politicized. When I say political urbanization, what I mean here is farmers should be better represented. When you make the decision, you got to take into consideration how farmers are thinking about it, or how you can improve the lives of the migrant workers. Because in China now, you have Shimi, you have Nomi, and then you have Nomingo. These are three categories of populations, and they are treated all differently. And there are like three categories of citizens in China. And this is what I mean, the destabilizing factor, because these people are pissed, they're angry, they're upset, and their anger could easily escalate into something we see in Tunisia, into something we see in Egypt, into something we see in Libya. So all things have to be done, and urbanization is very important, but it has to be managed in such a way so everyone could be treated equally. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liu. That's real eye-opening presentation, right? Yes.